Good afternoon. This is Elizabeth McCarty with the University of Georgia, and I'll be hosting and presenting this webinar today. So before I get too far into it, I do want to let everyone know that this is part of a webinar series. The series improves the quality of urban forests. The first day is beneficial pest insects. The second day is second day, I'm sorry, is about tree planting. The third day on Wednesday is forest water interface. On the 22nd, Thursday, we have invasive species threats and solutions for healthy urban forest. And on Friday, environmental education for the urban forest. So let's see. I'm so sorry, it won't let me share my video with y'all. So you just have to look at the PowerPoint slides. So let me share my screen. All right. All right. Ingvar, can you tell me if you can see my presentation?
Yes, it says beneficial and pest insects in urban forests, perspective and management.
Very good. That's the title of my talk. And I am a forest entomologist with the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Georgia. If you'll look at the top bar on your screen, or it may be located on the bottom, there is a chat and a Q&A area. If you have questions for the end of the presentation, please put it in the Q&A section, and we'll be monitoring that at the end of the presentation. If we put them in the chat section, it might end up getting lost in the shuffle. So this is a lot about perspective and some about management. The presentation goals are to help the attendees learn about beneficial and pest insects in urban forests. And note that I put pest in quotation marks, and there is a reason for that. Sometimes we think about things as being pests when they are not pests in all situations. Understand how to think through control options and learn to where to go for resources. All right, and I'm trying to, there we go. Oh. All right, just to review some of the control options I'll be speaking about, and really more where it will focus on the biology and how to think about these pests. But we think about doing a control option, we think about like we want to spray something. And so contact insecticide sprays can be used, and that's where usually it's more targeted for the foliage, but there's a picture, and there's a picture here in the middle of someone applying a contact insecticide spray to a pine tree. And that's being done out west for bark beetle control. A lot of times contact insecticide sprays will be applied to foliage on trees. And so it's pretty obvious from this picture that a lot of drift is happening with this contact insecticide spray. And sometimes that is not a great option, especially if the pest is not causing enough damage to really warrant doing that treatment. So when we think about an option, we have to think about both the benefits of that option, the need for that option, and also the risks of that option. There's always benefits and there's always risks. I think somebody might have their audio on. If you could please mute that. So that would be a contact insecticide spray. The next option would be a systemic spray, and those are systemic treatment. And that's an insecticide that is taken into the plant and is translocated or moved within the plant to where the insect is feeding. And those can be applied by multiple different methods. Basal drench, and that's pictured up at the top of the screen where a solution is being poured around the base of a hemlock tree in this case. I missed one in here. There's a soil drench, a soil injection, and then trunk sprays, which is sort of similar to this, but it's applied much lower on the tree, so it's not quite so messy. And then trunk injections, and there's a picture of me at the bottom doing a trunk injection to a pine tree. And then natural controls, and that would be things like Ingvar, I think that you're not muted. That would be things like letting biocontrol get in there and do their work, and just letting a situation be. And there's a lot of cases where we want to do that. All right. All right, I'm having a little bit of trouble advancing slides. So what happens in a forest, both an urban forest and a rural forest? Well, we have trees, and we have soil and water and air, and a lot of different processes happen. carbon dioxide, photosynthesize it, essentially kind of make energy from sunlight energy. Then leaves fall off the tree, it becomes leaf litter, it's decomposed, it's recycled back into the soil. And then there's respiration at the root layer. Plant respires and brings back oxygen. And everywhere in this process, there are different organisms. There's fungi, bacteria, insects, wildlife that are involved with it. It doesn't just happen between a tree and the soil and the air. There's lots of different interconnected layers in here. And so let's think about, from an insect perspective, here's a picture of a forest. And this picture here could show something that what is located just in a rural area, or this could be a vacant lot or the back of somebody's yard that's relatively unmaintained. And what's happening here? Well, there's different types of insects that are occurring in the urban forest. There's herbivores, and these are the ones that we typically think of as being, you know, quote unquote pest or bad because they eat plants. And we think that it's bad for an insect to be eating on a plant. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. The tridivores eat dead organic material and recycle that back into the system. Predators eat other organisms. Parasites live in or on other organisms. And pollinators move pollen from one flower to another. So pollinators are very hot topic right now. We're very concerned about them. Lots of people are making habitat for pollinators, and that's a very beneficial insect in our mindset. But I would argue that herbivores are just as an important part of that beneficial insect community. If we got rid of all the herbivores today, there's some breakdown that wouldn't happen. The predators would lose their food source. So all these things are interconnected, and we can't just take one of them out. So I would encourage everybody to think about beneficial insects as actually being all of these. But I'm not unmindful of the fact that when one of these would happen to be invasive, like Asian longhorn borer, hemlock woolly adelgid, there's no way that is just not beneficial. And there are times that depending on the tree and the location, something that is a native part of our ecosystem can be present to a degree that is problematic for us. But we do have these insects, and they are functioning in different layers in the forest. Urban forest as well, from canopy to tree trunks, the shrub layer, herbaceous layer, the forest floor, and even in streams. And so before we start isolating just what's happening in one tree, it's good to be mindful of that entire situation, that entire community. And then I've shown pictures of, we have this section of forest, and these are all the things that could be happening here. And so notice some of them are just beneficial, like a tiger moth, like a native bee, and a stonefly, and a seed dispersing ant, and a predator of bark beetles. And then some of them are things that we think of as pest insects, like pine titmoth, webworms, Sycamore Lacebug, and black twig borer. So it really depends on what's happening in the surrounding area as to whether something will be a pest. Pine titmoth, for instance, in an isolated pine tree that's just regenerating in the forest is probably not going to be problematic. But when we have an entire stand of young pine trees and they're all being hit by pine titmoth and all of the growing tips are being knocked out, then it becomes a problem. Fall webworm is typically not an issue if it's in a tree in the backyard, but if it's in the entrance of a subdivision or a golf course and where the aesthetics are more important, then that threshold of where it becomes problematic does change. So breaking this down into the different insects that we can find in the urban forest, we have butterflies and moths, and those are herbivores and pollinators. And I know that I will leave out some of these groups, so just know that they could serve more functions. Beetles can be pollinators, herbivores, detritivores, and predators. So there may be a beetle that's feeding on a tree, it's native, it just comes and goes, it doesn't really cause a problem, or it could be one that is problematic and the damage level is not acceptable. So it's really nice that we can recognize that all of these options exist instead of just drawing a line and saying bad. Flies they can be pollinators, herbivores, detritivores, predators, parasites, so lots of different functions depending on the system and the species. Wasps can be pollinators, herbivores, predators, and parasites. And then true bugs. These are mostly herbivores, but can also be detritivores and predators. And a lot of the pest insects that we think about as being pests on trees do come from this group. So I'm going to walk through numerous different tree pests or tree insects. And I'll use those words interchangeably, but just because something's classified as a pest, again, doesn't necessarily mean that a control option will be merited. But we'll walk through a lot of things. I'll cover things, a lot of caterpillars. We'll go on to some beetles and some true bugs. So fall webworm is one that is in many places in the country. And I noticed that we do have participants from Florida and New York and Idaho. I'm having more of a southeastern perspective on these things. Let's see, do I get the video going yet? There we go, now you can see me. I have a bit more of a southeastern perspective on some of these things, so there may be some differences depending on where in the country that you are. My email will be at the end of the website. We have after the end of the webinar on the last slide, so you're welcome to email me with questions and I'll get back within 48 hours. So fall webworm is a native caterpillar. They have these glistening webs in treetops. So I took this picture. In 2018, there was a lot of webworm activity in Georgia. And so this shows a tree that will very likely be completely defoliated. This is a picture I took in North Georgia, maybe not the wisest place for me to stop and take a picture, but lots of webs in the canopy. So this is pretty heavy damage. Webworms can defoliate entire trees, and they have hundreds of hosts: pecan, hickory, walnut, sweet gum, river birch. So let's make some distinctions. Damage to a tree in the forest of these native pests, just isolated damage like webworm damage in the forest, is typically not going to be problematic. Webworm damage in an ornamental landscape, urban forest setting may or may not be problematic. And then webworm damage in pecan crops or walnut crops can be more problematic because they're trying to get a crop harvest. So those are three different situations. And then if something's defoliating a tree, it's a big difference on if it's a hardwood or a conifer. Conifers typically don't take very kindly to be defoliated. Hardwoods handle it much better. If a hardwood tree is completely defoliated, they can generally recover unless there was some other health issue going on. And sometimes they can be defoliated for a couple of years and be okay, they'll recover, especially if the defoliation occurs later in the year when they're about to lose their leaves anyway. Now, over time, defoliation can deplete their reserves and make them more susceptible to other tree health issues. There are always exceptions to every rule, but just because a hardwood tree gets defoliated does not mean that it's going to die. All right. Fall webworm, the adults are white. They may or may not have spots on their wings. They have up to 5 generations a year. So a lot of these insects that have multiple generations a year, it's quite common to see more problematic damage later in the season as those populations have grown larger throughout the season. There are 2 color forms. There's a red-headed and a black-headed. The red-headed has a more southern distribution, which means that it makes up a greater proportion of the southern populations, whereas the black-headed is more northern distribution. That being said, we do get both forms down here in Georgia where I am. And here are some pictures I took in the lab of the black-headed on the left and the red-headed on the right. And so those are both collected on the UGA Tipton campus. And then I show another picture. Here is another black-headed one. So there can be quite a difference in color variation in these. The females begin laying eggs in the streams, the caterpillar in the spring. The caterpillars develop in a web, and the purpose of these webs is for protecting the caterpillars. And then as they get older, they will leave the nest and go feed on the foliage that is outside of the web, and they'll scooch back into those nests right before daylight. Sometimes in the morning, you can still see them still moving around. Typically, their copulations are naturally controlled by parasites and predators. If you open up a nest and allow access in, it generally does do a good job of controlling them, but that's not feasible for all trees on the environment. So let's recognize that. So this picture here was taken on the UGA Tipton campus. And on the left is a picture of a pecan tree that is loaded up with fall webworms. This is when we had a particularly bad year. probably the worst year in about 2 decades. And on the right is also tree damage from Sycamore Lacebug. Notice that the canopy is yellowing. It doesn't quite look like fall leaf color. So sometimes these damage can be quite startling, and a lot of times both these pest insects have numerous generations during the year, and it's not until later in the year that it gets this marked. If control if control is necessary, right, can somebody please text in the chat if y'all can hear me? Because my screen is saying that I've been muted. Yes, you can hear me. Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. Now I have to remember where I was in this. Yes, it's best to control them when the caterpillars are younger. Usually the younger form of insects are going to be a little bit more vulnerable, and that's before the populations gets bigger. But it's kind of one of those things that you wish you could see 5 months into the future and control it before you know that it's really going to get out of hand. So not a perfect answer, unfortunately. All right, the webbing can make control more difficult. If sort of like if you know beforehand, systemic insecticides can be possible on higher value tree. Contact insecticide control can be difficult if you're trying to spray them in the web. It's hard for the spray to penetrate the web. Or, and this might just be my little, my different approach to things, but pull one down, let the kids play with them, let them enjoy about nature. It's a great science education moment. All right, next is Eastern tent caterpillar. These have the nest in the crotches of trees, so right at the base of where trees are branching off. And they use the nest for a similar purpose. They don't feed within leaves at that point, but they hide out during the nest, and they leave the nest when it's dark, when they feel a little more protected from predators, feed on the leaves, and then retreat back into the nest, usually during the daytime. This one only has one generation each year, and it usually starts a little bit earlier in the year in the spring. Control options are usually not justified. These typically don't have damage to the level where control is going to be needed. It's usually a more aesthetic problem. Many prunus species, as well as others, get attacked by these. If absolutely necessary, contact insecticides would be reasonable, but it would have to be in the right circumstances. They can defoliate entire trees during an outbreak, but that being said, those are few and far between, and the trees will survive. It would be rare for outbreaks to occur year after year where it would be problematic for tree health, not that it couldn't happen. The caterpillars do leave the tree to pupate, and that can be a nuisance for some people whenever they see the caterpillars wandering around, and that's maybe distasteful for them if they're stepping on them and things like that. This does occur earlier in the season than webworms, so most of the damage is observed usually in May, depending on where you are in the latitude. And then the larvae do get up to 2.5 inches long, and notice that there is this stripe along the back, and then these blue-black spots along the side. So here's a better picture of it, a white stripe, and then these blue-black spots along the side. Next, we're moving to forest tent caterpillar. So these are really similar, and sometimes I have to look back to remember the difference with forest tent. With eastern tent having the stripe along the back, forest tent caterpillar has footsteps going along the back. So it looks like somebody dipped their feet in yellow paint and walked across the back of this caterpillar. And then there are blue stripes along the side. Deciduous trees are the host. These don't make a noticeable nest. Instead, they tend to aggregate on the trunks and sometimes can have this silken mat that adheres kind of closely to the side of the trunk. And so most people notice them all, gumped up together on the trunk of the tree. I've been hearing a little bit more about these. I usually don't get any calls on it. I've gotten a couple this year. Think about if you're a bird, and this is a great food source. So I would recommend not going and hitting these things with pesticides. If you don't absolutely have to, it's really rare that you would. larval caterpillars are a wonderful food source for bugs. They're birds, they're laying nests, they need that food source. So if at all possible, let them just hang out there. All right, so you'll get the clusters on the trunks. They overwinter as eggs and are more active in the spring. So April around here, we're getting a lot of them. If you're further north, you may get more of them a little bit later in the season. There's one generation each year. So these are a tad earlier than the eastern tent caterpillars. They'll overwinter as egg masses. And again, older instars can wander around, sometimes being a nuisance. I'm usually just pretty delighted when I get to find one and let it crawl along my hand. Natural enemies are going to be important for control. And again, control is generally not warranted or easily done. That being said, these can occur at outbreak levels. I grew up in Louisiana, and so I saw them a lot more there than I do now living in Georgia. They can have annual outbreaks on water tupelo, and so I did see that a lot growing up. But otherwise, outbreaks are a bit more spread apart, and trees are rarely killed. So just to review the different caterpillars we've covered so far, because they seem pretty similar, they all have webbing. Forest tent has the footsteps. It occurs earliest in the year, and they can accumulate on the trunks of trees. Eastern tent caterpillar has the yellowish stripe along the back and the blueback circles along the side. They have their nest in the crotch of trees, and we usually see their activity around May. And fall webworm can have some variation in their colors. They have the nest further out on the branches, and they have many generations a year. So if you think starting earlier in the year with forest tent, we're on the trunk, we move up to the crotches with eastern tent a little bit later in the year, and at the end we'll have fall webworm further out on the branches. And that's how I kind of remember to separate these things. And then lastly, I'll mention European gypsy moth. I'm mostly covering native pest in this talk, so I don't want to go into great detail, but this is an invasive pest. We don't want this here. There's a program to monitor and treat for it. It's called the Slow the Spread program, but I just want this to be on everyone's radar. There's 5 sets of blue spots closer to the head and 6 sets of red spots toward the end of its body. If you see this, this would be one where you need to contact either your county extension service or your forestry agency for your state. And again, that depends on where it is. If you're in the Northeast and you're already in the area where it's established, then probably don't make the contact. But if you're somewhere where it's not established, then please do let somebody know that you're seeing it. More caterpillars. Oakworms. These things are pretty awesome. They can get a couple inches long. They don't quite extend down to where I am in South Georgia, but we do get quite a bit of them in the Atlanta area. They are some pretty fabulous caterpillars. There are 3 common species that we get: the orange striped oakworm, the pink striped, and the spiny oakworm. And those are all pictured on the bottom of the screen. These guys can really strip an oak tree quickly. The defoliation usually occurs in late summer to fall. And so I start getting calls in August on this one. But like all of the other caterpillars, they usually do not harm the tree. It's a minor impact. I don't recommend, at the point that we get called, there's a lot of damage and people want to start spraying the entire canopy of their tree with contact insecticide. I don't recommend that. There are a few high value spots where that might be warranted, but I would really not recommend that for most situations at all. Otherwise, just let them be. What's most problematic and distressing to people is that these let go a large amount of frass. So there can be quite a lot of frass covering patios and pool decks and things like that. So it can be a nuisance in those ways. Another caterpillar are bagworms. Bagworms are actually moths. These are mostly an issue with conifers. We see them a lot in ornamental conifers. The egg will hatch and the caterpillar will make a little bag. So think about it like some caterpillar larvae almost behave like snails, and they make this little house and they carry it with them just like a snail does. And so that's what they do. They carry their bag around with them as they feed on the tree. And then later in the season, they'll actually make that location permanent, and then the bags can be really hard to pull off at that point. The males emerge and actually fly around. The females do not. They just hang out in their bag the rest of their life. the male will meet with the female, and then the female lays eggs and dies. There are control recommendations for this, for spraying contact insecticides. A lot of times I'll see this in ornamental shrubs, and their damage can be pretty bad. Usually it's not an issue, and just leave it alone. But if it's in a really prominent location and it can't be settled by picking the bags off, then that would be where you consider doing a contact insecticide, possibly a systemic insecticide. But just because you see bags at that moment doesn't necessarily mean that the live sage is susceptible. Sometimes they're at this point where they're already adhered on, they're not feeding anymore. And so if the male in this picture is actually mating with the female, you can see the wings, it's holding on to the end of the bag and then curving its abdomen forward to mate. And at this point, nobody's feeding, and a contact insecticide spray would not be very valuable. Leaf miners. Leaf miners are pretty cool. I first noticed these working in a citrus greenhouse in South Alabama, and I always knew them as serpentine leaf miners. So notice that there's a little caterpillar in here, and it's digging. I'm sorry, yeah, a little caterpillar in this. It's digging a tunnel. They can also be beetle flies or sawflies. So a lot of different groups of insects can mine leaves. And serpentine ones are the ones that dig a little tunnel through. And then there's also blotch leaf mines, the picture up at the top, where their damage just ends up having a blotchy appearance. I had always wrongly assumed that this was some kind of pathogen, but it's actually an insect causing the damage. They feed between the top and the bottom surface of the leaves in that in-between area, and then causes those tissues to pull apart. Generally, they're not a problem with plant health. Natural controls can kind of keep them down. They can be more problematic in ornamental or nursery settings. But again, when you apply the product, if you have to treat, really matters. If you're applying something like a contact insecticide and it's protected within the leaf, unless that insecticide absorbs translaminarly through the leaves, it won't have an impact. So be really mindful of the timing and the applications or methods you would consider. Gallmakers. Gallmakers make this amazing variety of different galls, and galls can be on different parts of the plant. We've got pictures of leaves here, but they can also occur on stems and other tissues. These are not economically important in forest stands. They won't kill the tree. They just are sometimes unsightly and most of the time very interesting. But on ornamentals or Christmas trees, they can be problematic. So what happens is an arthropod, and I say arthropod because mites can be gallmakers as well, will lay eggs on a plant, and they produce a chemical that causes the plant to grow abnormal tissues around it for the larva to feed in. And so they're causing the plant to sort of grow a banquet for the feeding larva. Again, they're found on leaves, buds, stems, and roots. Often the culprits are gall wasps, gall midges, and mites. And so here's a picture of one that an environmental scientist brought to my lab. We cut it open, started looking around for it, and pulled out the feeding larva. So I'm not sure how many people we have on here who are in the ornamental insect control, but scales is one that come up quite often with ornamentals. And that is because scales can produce honeydew, which causes the growth of sooty mold. And then people look out and they see that they get concerned that there's a pathogen on their tree that's turning all of the leaves black and killing the tree. And so that's the most obvious sign of scale damage. Scales suck plant fluids. There are many different species. And so identifying which species of scale you have is critical to understanding what the next steps are. Scales are often not a problem. They largely go unnoticed, but there's no simple one-size-fits-all scale control measure. They are generally divided into soft scales and hard scales. And so there are some really critical differences between those two as far as how to control it, how to approach it. So soft scales are about 1/4 inch long, and they usually have a smooth, cottony, or waxy surface. These guys excrete honeydew. Honeydew is a really sugary substance that they excrete out of their abdomen, and then that falls down onto foliage and the ground and leaves below the tree. And then that sugary substance is a great place for mold to grow. It's usually city mold that has a black or grayish appearance, and then kind of makes this crusty kind of surface over the leaf. City mold won't kill the tree, but it is pretty ugly and it can be hard to get off. And these usually have one generation a year. So that is nice because there's not multiple generations. More generations means more chance for damage and greater population growth quite often. And then armored scales. These are a little bit more challenging. They're a bit smaller, around eighth of an inch, but again, that depends on the species. And they have a plate-like body covering that's made from substances they secrete, as well as their dead old cast skins that just kind of enamel up over them as a protective covering, and the body is underneath. So below is a picture of a hard scale, and above is a drawing of the bottom of one, where the hard scale is the brown part and the adult female is the yellowish part. And then the string that looks like it's going from her is the piercing sucking mouth part that is stuck into the plants to suck plant fluids. So think about oysters on the half shell, where there's a protective oyster shell on the bottom and then a squishy, mushy oyster part in the inside. And that's basically what an armored scale is like. And so if you flip that half shell over and put it down on the surface, that's what an armored scale is like feeding on a tree. And that armor protects it from things like contact insecticides. So once they are developed to the point that they have an armor, then controlling them can be very difficult. But then again, for soft scales, once they have a waxy covering, controlling them may be more difficult as well. And then these usually have more than one generation a year. Control options. The first question is, should you control the scale? Maybe, maybe not. If it's not causing damage, then maybe not. I've got some scales back on one of the, gardenias in the back of my yard. If the back corner of my yard, I just let it go. But if it's in the very front, if it's the front of a subdivision, if it's an ornamental planting leading up to a building or the botanical garden, then that approach may not be consistent with their management objectives. So some options: horticulture oil and insecticidal soap. And those are both insecticides. An insecticide is something that will kill an insect. So it's not like horticulture oil and insecticidal soap are like free. They're still insecticides. Those are options, usually for the crawler stage. So the crawler stage, the stage that crawls around before settling down, is most susceptible. But unfortunately, a lot of times we're not going to notice at the crawler stage, we'll notice much later. Contact insecticides may be possible for crawlers, and then for some of the soft scales. Systemic insecticides are possible, but not all systemic insecticides work on all types of scales. So it's really important to first identify the scale, and that's where you may contact your local county extension. Every state has an extension service, and most states have diagnostic labs where there are specialists who can identify. And so the correct route is typically to go through your county extension agent. They will forward the sample to the diagnostic lab so you can get an ID on that scale and then make your decisions once you know what you're dealing with. And then there's also, insect growth regulators. And the best method for control, if warranted, really depends on what the scale is and when the damage is found. Sycamore Lacebug. This is a really cool one. It occurs on the Tifton campus and the sycamore tree that I use for practice climbing. So I typically kind of keep a good eye on these when I'm out and about. It is a hemiptera, so we're a true bug, just like the scale insects. And these feed on leaves, both the nymphs and the adults. And so the picture on the bottom corner shows the underside of a leaf. And on that, you can see the brown immatures, the adult, that's this cream color with some markings on the back, and then some brown spots of frass, and you may also observe cast skins. So this is specifically Sycamore lacebug, but there are many different kinds of lacebugs out there. So These things are a little more specific to sycamore lacebugs, but some of the generalities can also be applied to other lacebug species. There are several generations a year. Again, with more generations, we typically have a buildup of populations, so the damage can often be observed more commonly later in the year, depending on the species. The nymphs are dark colored again, and the adults are broad and have this lacy appearance to their wings and their coverings. The natural enemies are usually effective to keep those populations at manageable levels. They cause chlorotic spots. So these have a piercing, sucking mouth part. So when they pierce the leaf, it can cause a yellowing in that spot, which can be, not visually appealing. Most cases, it's not problematic, but again, in some high value, very visible places, it may not be desirable to let it be that way. That being said, once it starts to show the chlorotic damage, you can't reverse that. So the recommendations would be to notice where damage is happening. If it's later in the year, mark that down to start observing earlier in the next year. And then there may be some chemical control that's warranted for high value visible trees, but most of the time it won't be. So here's a blown up picture of the adult and the immatures. The chlorotic spots. And so they start out along the leaf veins with this yellowing spotty appearance. And then later in the season, it can end up really broadening out and covering more of the leaf. We've got a couple trees on campus that do get heavy damage. Most September is usually when I see it, August, September, and they come back and they're fine. It doesn't kill the tree. That being said, I've said a lot of times it won't kill the tree. There are always exceptions to the rules. There's always that situation where maybe you just have a tree that gets hit over and over and over again, but that's not typical at all. Next, I'll cover a couple of ambrosia beetles, and I will end with plenty of time for questions and answers, so we should be able to walk through that instead of having to run through that. Ambrosia beetles, there are lots of different kinds of ambrosia beetles. There's not one ambrosia beetle species, but many kinds. Some of them are native, some of them are not native. So it depends on the species, really. They're usually very small and can cause damage in hardwoods. So if I forget to say it later, ambrosia beetles in hardwoods and ambrosia beetles in pines are very different things. These are decomposers. They are part of the breakdown process. They carry fungi with them and these little pockets on their body. They'll lay an egg, they'll make some galleries, lay their eggs, they distribute their fungi, and they're not actually eating the tree. They are making space in the tree to grow a fungal garden, which their larvae then eat. And so they push out all the tree materials, and they're really interested in the space. Now in pine trees, these are purely, they're decomposers. So they're going to move in after the bark beetles have hit and when the tree is dead or nearly dead. And I get calls where there's sawdust along the base of the tree and people feel like whatever is causing that sawdust to be there is killing the tree, when in actuality, that's just one more step along the tree death process, but is not causing death of the tree. That being said, switching back to hardwoods, there are some that will attack hardwoods that are healthy. And so that is not at all the same case. Ambrosia beetles are more problematic in hardwoods, especially in ornamental settings and in nursery conditions. And then there are some invasive ones that like the red ray ambrosia beetle that causes laurel wilt, and that is more problematic. Again, many species, some native, some non-native. And so talking about these, whenever I say this insect doesn't cause a problem, that is not counting for all things. So red ray ambrosia beetle, for instance, does cause a problem. Most ambrosia beetles may attack more stressed trees, but again, not in every situation. It really depends on the species. So it's hard to pull a lot of generalities for these. And critical is identifying which ambrosia beetle you're dealing with and the value of the resource and the resource's tolerance for damage. If it's a nursery setting, then the tolerance for damage is pretty low. And so that's where control would be warranted. Then black twig borer is another one that is non-native, but generally is not overly problematic. And so note that there are dead twigs in an otherwise green canopy. That's an indication that something, an insect is hitting the twigs. If there are dead twigs on the ground that are brown, probably some kind of a twig borer, twig chafer, twig girdler. If there are green twigs on the ground, that is most likely a squirrel. They'll knock the twig, they'll chew on the twigs and let them fall to the ground. But when insects hit twigs, they'll typically damage the twig will die on the limb and then eventually fall down. Sometimes they don't fall down at all. Black twig borer damage is noticed by a little hole. And then if the twig is cut open, there is a tunnel with the gallery, with the beetle in the gallery. And then two more beetles, I believe, Elm Leaf Beetle and larger Elm Leaf Beetle. We've had some problem with these in Georgia in recent years in the middle to northern part of the state. Two different species, very similar, so the information for each of them would be pretty similar. The Elm Leaf Beetle is a smaller beetle. It's 6 to 7 millimeters, and it is not native to the US. It is from Europe. And it has this longitudinal stripe on the elytra or the hardwing coverings. These skeletonized leaves, so the larger Elm Leaf Beetle will have that similar pattern of the leaf skeletonizing. Their larvae look pretty similar, so it may not be initially apparent. And sometimes we don't see the adults, sometimes we just see the larvae. I'd say 2 to 3 generations a year. I have 3 with question mark. The best extension document I could find from it was from further north. So it may be that there are more generations further south. I just can't say for certain that there are or are not. And then the larger Elm Leaf Beetle is native. There are 10 to 16 millimeters, so quite a bit bigger. 1 generation a year on each of these. Same thing, they defoliate elm trees by skeletonizing them. So for these, systemic insecticides may be effective earlier in the year, but that's kind of before you know that you're getting the damage. Contact insecticide on limited parts of foliage may be warranted. Please don't do whole canopy sprays of big trees. The trees will likely recover. And so be conservative when you approach it. If the tree is already completely defoliated, please don't start spraying contact insecticide. And I think the key with these is to be mindful and keep your eye on the trees earlier, and then and be aware of what might come up. If Elm Leaf Beetle was a problem last year, keep your eye open for it this year. It may crop up again. And then lastly, for resources. So it doesn't do much good to know about things and know that there are measures out there without knowing where to go to get help. So county extension agents are great resources, as well as your state's forestry commission, depending on if you're dealing with ornamental or forest trees. And then the extension service has specialists. So I'm the forest health specialist for Georgia, but your state likely has somebody in the forestry or entomology department that can be pulled in by an extension agent if additional information is needed. Most states' extension services put out a pest management handbook. So here is the link to the one in Georgia, and there is a trees chapter, but this is Georgia. You're welcome to look at this one. We rewrote the chapter in 2017, so it's very up to date, and we re-update it every year. Be mindful when you look at pest management handbooks among the different states. It's good to kind of look for some general information, but be aware that pesticides recommended in Georgia may not necessarily be legal in New York. So be aware of your state regulations, and that would be contacting either the Extension Service or the Department of Agriculture to make sure that whatever pesticide you consider using is okay to use in your state. The Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Georgia has many different outreach publications. There's a lot of hemlock woolly diligent work there that I've written, as well as some other ones, but a good source for that. The Center for Invasive Species and Ecosystem Health, otherwise known as Bugwood, which is also at the University of Georgia. They have numerous forest insect, tree insect publications. Again, your state extension service. The United States Forest Service has a lot of publications. You may also have an arboriculture or IAS chapter in your state that's a good source for information. I strongly encourage you to seek out sources that end in .edu or .gov. The internet has some great information and some information that is not so helpful. And some of the information that's not very helpful is packaged very nicely. So .edu.gov, state and federal agencies and the university system, that has an extension arm is the best place to start looking for information. Again, read all pesticide labels very carefully. A pesticide label is like a safety fence. That is the boundaries in which you should use that pesticide to operate safely with it. It's also a legal document. And so once someone uses that pesticide, they are bound by that label as the legal way to use the pesticide. And so with that, I'll be glad to take any questions. I'll put my email in the chat and I will stop my share for just a little bit. All right, so my email is in the chat now if you have any questions that you need answered more immediately, and I'll look over at the Q&A. Does fall webworm kill trees? No, it usually does not. There can always be exceptions to the rules. If it's a smaller tree, then it may end up causing some damage, especially if it's like a young pecan tree and it's totally defoliated. But typically, trees will survive. Can I speak more about beneficial insects? Which are the best predators to try and encourage in your urban forest and yard? I don't know that it's possible to encourage specific native beneficial insects, but having good habitat is really important. I speak quite a bit about urban forest habitat development and the things to develop healthy habitats in urban forest. If the person asking that question would like, you're welcome to send me an email and I can send you a link to a presentation. I believe it's publicly available that I did for Trees Atlanta on that topic. So it says a comment, thanks for your attention to these pests, as not always cause for alarm. Lepidoptera larvae are important food sources for migratory songbirds. That is very true. Can we get a copy of the presentation? I believe that you will be able to. I have to check on the details for that, but this webinar is also going to always be available on forestry webinars. So it'll be easy to go through and look at that again. So I'll have to check on the details. It's been about 4 months since I've done one of these. And so I don't at this moment remember the details on the timing for that. But if any of the other panelists want to answer that question, please do chime in.
Hey, Dr. McCarty. Hey, Dr. McCarty.
Yes.
Yes. The course has to get turned into a video. It takes a few hours for that. And then I will send the course over to SREF and they'll put it on the page. I'll send the video over to the SREF and they'll put it on the page. So it should be on there sometime later this afternoon or in the morning.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Let's see. I have a few more questions coming in. If you have more questions, please put them in the Q&A. Several years ago, I saw a lot of sand pine that had ambrosia beetles, no bark beetles present, yet the ambrosia seemed to be what killed the trees, including groups of trees and small stands. Any comments? So this is in the Gulf Coast. Sometimes what we have happen with, whenever a tree is getting attacked by bark beetles and ambrosia beetles, we also get termites in there and a lot of other things kind of destroy the evidence. Another thing that can happen with bark beetles, we look for those characteristic pitch tubes, but the presence of pitch tubes or the absence of pitch tubes can't rule out bark beetles. When trees end up in poor health, their ability to make that much pitch to flush the beetles out really goes down. So a lot of times with Ips, example, or engraver beetles attacking unhealthy trees, they don't actually make pitch tubes because they don't have the resources to do that. So we may see the sawdust from the ambrosia beetles, but not see those pitch tubes. And then if you take the bark off the tree, sometimes we can see evidence of pitch tubes, but sometimes things like termites have already gotten in there and taken out that evidence. And all we see is really that phloem layer is just gone. Do control burns favor the reappearance of particular insect pest? That is better a question for a burn person. I don't work with burns very much. I would say it really depends on the state of the stand and the burn. If the burn intensity gets too hot and the trees are damaged or stressed, then yeah, you can get some bark beetles in there afterwards. And I do see that where the fire was too hot, it went up too high. The hardwoods were there too much hardwoods before the burn, and then the trees were stressed and more susceptible to subsequent bark beetles. So part of that would be doing a responsible burn and doing that correctly. And then any further than that, that advice is going to have to come from somebody who does burns more than I do. What are the predators for any leaf miners, twig borers, what keeps populations in check? For specific ones, I can give you some general predators, and then specific predators are really going to depend on the species. There are hemipteran predators. A lot of flies and wasps are parasitoids, and so they will lay eggs in and on other insects, and then the larvae will grow in and on the insects and kill them. So there's lots of different options, but I don't know a specific species for leaf miners and twig borers. Something that's invasive is not going to have or non-native is not going to have as much of a suite of predators. There are generalist predators that'll kind of hit anything, and then there are some specialist predators that will hit specific groups of insects. And if it is a non-native insect, it may have a reduced suite of predators that feed on it. Some research out there on the use of sound vibrations on bagworms. I do not have any information on that. That is fascinating, but I will definitely look it up after I give this presentation. All right. Let me look. There's one I missed here. When you say systemic insecticide, do you mean that the chemical is applied directly to the bug? No, systemic insecticides are applied to the plant, either on the trunk or applied on this ground through the soil. So if you do a soil application, it is absorbed through the roots and moved throughout the tree canopy, say, and it would get a Sycamore Lacebug or whatever's feeding on the canopy. Not all systemic insecticides are the same. Be really careful with applying them for things like borers. Some systemic insecticides stay in the xylem. Some of them can move into the phloem a little bit, so it really depends on which one. And so the specific product and the time should be very carefully selected. For foliage, it's not quite as tricky, but for something like a hemlock, and that's my area of expertise, is systemic insecticides and hemlock, and then the environmental effects of systemic insecticides. So that's really where the well of knowledge is deep as far as me. So I'll try not to go too far out on this. But if you're applying systemic insecticides into the canopy, then the insecticide matters as far as how long it'll last and how effective it'll be. But especially in the trunk of the tree, they're not all created equally. So that would be where you look to your county extension service, Forest Service, look for .edu and .gov for information on those. Okay. I think what has been my favorite pest to come across? I specialize in hemlock woolly adelgids, so I guess that's my favorite one. I love working in that system, and I really want them to die. How effective is BT on gypsy moth infested forest? Very effective. So the Slow the Spread program that the Forest Service does in concert with state agencies, there's different phases where they do different control measures, and BT is one of the control measures that they use for gypsy moths. Okay, not a question, but if people want to use natural predation to protect their trees, bats are a great option. Big brown bats, Mexican free-tail bats, and southeastern bats readily occupy bat houses and are big predators of moths and beetles. Thank you for that. Making habitat, especially in urban areas, we have really sterilized our habitat to a lot of hard surfaces, houses, lawns, and many different landscape plantings that don't always offer a well-rounded habitat. So supplementing that habitat is a wonderful option. And I would look for more from the UGA outreach team on that kind of information. We're in the process of really developing that part of our program. All right, I don't see any more questions. I want to thank everyone for being on today and to remind everyone that this is part of a series. And so there will be other presentations later this week, tomorrow with proper tree planting. I may get this order out of order. So, but there is a one about the water land interface in urban forest, invasive species, and environmental education. Thank you all for your time and have a great afternoon.
Do you want to stop recording? Yes, I'm going to go ahead and stop it.